That number, just let it sit there for a second. $7 trillion. That is larger than the entire GDP of Japan, larger than Germany and the United Kingdom combined, almost double the market cap of Nvidia, the most valuable company on earth today. That is the estimated peak value of one company. Not a country, not a government, not a military alliance, a company with shareholders and a board of directors and a stock price listed on the London Exchange. This company collected taxes from 250 million people. It controlled more territory than the British government itself. It ran a trade network so dominant that it single-handedly shaped the price of goods across the entire world. And it started with 218 merchants in a London coffee house who simply wanted to buy pepper cheaper. This is the story of the East India Company, the most valuable corporation ever created, and how it built its fortune on a system that made collapse inevitable. This is a story about money, but more than that, it is a story about what happens when the pursuit of profit is given the power of a government, and then cannot be taken back. About how the East India Company became the richest commercial entity in human history, how it extracted wealth from an entire continent on behalf of its shareholders, how the same financial logic that made it unstoppable made its destruction unavoidable. Because here's what most people never understand. The East India Company was not primarily a military operation. The army came later. The army was a cost. The thing that actually built this empire was the financial instrument it invented to fund it. By the end of this video, you will understand why the most valuable company in history could not survive its own wealth. To understand how a company became worth $7 trillion, you need to understand what spices meant in 1600. Today, you shake pepper onto your food without thinking about it. In 1600, that same pepper sold for more than silver by weight across large parts of Europe. Not because it tasted good, because it preserved meat. In a world with no refrigeration, spices were the difference between eating and not eating through a northern European winter. The markup between what spices cost at source and what they fetched in London was obscene. Early Portuguese voyages to Asia returned margins of 3,000%. 3,000% on a single voyage. The Portuguese had controlled these routes for nearly a century. The Dutch were building their own rival empire in the same waters. English merchants were arriving late to a game already in progress, watching enormous fortunes being made by everyone except them. And then they had an idea that would change the world. On the last day of the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed a royal charter. She granted 218 London merchants a monopoly, exclusive, legally protected, enforceable by the Crown, the right to all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. But the charter was not just a trade license. It contained something new, something that had never quite existed before in this form: joint stock ownership. You did not have to be a merchant. You did not have to sail anywhere. You did not have to risk your life on a 6-month voyage across unknown waters. You could simply invest money and receive a proportional share of whatever came back. This was the birth of the modern stock company, and for a brief moment, it was just a clever way to finance a spice run. It would become something considerably more consequential. The numbers from those early voyages were extraordinary. The first EIC voyage returned a profit of nearly 170%. The second, even more. Early investors who had risked modest savings were becoming wealthy men. Word spread. More capital came in. The EIC's stock became the most sought-after investment in England. Its share price did not just rise, it became the benchmark against which all other investments were measured. For ordinary London merchants, buying EIC stock was the closest thing they had ever seen to guaranteed wealth. To sustain those returns, the company needed physical presence on the ground. Warehouses, protected ports, local relationships. By the 1640s, the EIC had established permanent bases along India's coastline. Each post was essentially a fortified counting house, a place to store goods, manage accounts, and shelter staff. And here is where the financial logic began to shift. You cannot protect a trading post with accountants, so you hire guards. You cannot protect guards against organized opposition with guards alone, so you raise a company militia. And suddenly, a line item on the balance sheet that read trade expenses starts to read something different. The army was not the empire. The army was the cost of protecting the empire. And that distinction would eventually destroy everything. By the mid-1700s, the EIC was profitable. Enormously profitable. But it was still a trading company. What it wanted, what its shareholders' returns increasingly demanded, was not just access to Indian wealth. It was control of Indian wealth. Bengal alone, a single province, produced an estimated 40% of global textile exports. Its cotton and silk were so refined that British wool manufacturers had lobbied Parliament to ban their import because they could not compete. Whoever controlled Bengal's revenue did not need to trade. They simply needed to collect. June 23, 1757. The EIC forces faced the army of Siraj-ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Bengal. But Robert Clive, the EIC's commander on the ground, was not there to win a battle. He was there to close a deal. Weeks before the battle, Clive had made contact with Mir Jafar, Siraj's own senior military commander. The terms? If Mir Jafar stood his forces down when the fighting started, the EIC would install him as the new Nawab of Bengal. And the financial arrangement that accompanied that deal was staggering. The EIC received a payment of approximately £2.5 million from the new Nawab's treasury, the equivalent of roughly £350 million in today's money. Robert Clive personally collected £234,000. In today's terms, approximately $40 million, paid directly to a company executive for engineering a regime change. But even that payment was nothing, because what Plassey really unlocked was not a one-time payout, it was a revenue stream. Bengal's annual tax revenues, the ongoing income from the richest province in Asia, were now accessible to a London corporation. This was the moment the $7 trillion company was truly born. In 1765, 8 years after Plassey, the EIC achieved something no trading company had ever achieved in history. The Mughal emperor formally granted the company the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The Diwani was the legal right to collect taxes across 3 of the most productive provinces in Asia. Not a trade license, not a concession, not a partnership. The sovereign right to extract revenue from 30 million people. The numbers shifted immediately and dramatically. Before the Diwani, the EIC made its money on the spread between buying prices in Asia and selling prices in London. After the Diwani, it collected taxes, at scale, without having to trade at all. EIC stocks surged. Investors who had been wealthy became extraordinarily wealthy. Parliament celebrated. The press celebrated. Clive was made a baron. The company was held up as the supreme achievement of British commercial genius. And in London, no one asked the obvious question. If the EIC is extracting this much revenue from Bengal, what is left for the people living there? In 1769 and 1770, Bengal experienced a catastrophic famine. Historians call it the Great Bengal Famine. Crops failed, food supplies collapsed. Estimates of the death toll range from 7 to 10 million people. Approximately 1/3 of Bengal's entire population in 2 years. And through all of it, the East India Company continued collecting taxes. Not only did collection continue, in the years before the famine, the EIC had systematically redirected Bengal's most fertile farmland away from food crops. Indigo, opium, cotton. Cash crops the company could export at profit, grown on land that had once fed the people living on it. When the rains failed, there was nothing left. No reserve, no fallback, no food in the ground. The year 10 million people died in Bengal, the East India Company paid its shareholders a dividend of 10%. That is not the behavior of a rogue operation. That is the behavior of a system working exactly as designed. The EIC was not built to feed Bengal. It was built to extract value from Bengal. And it was extraordinarily disciplined about the difference. This is what economists call externalizing costs. The profit went to shareholders in London. The cost, measured in 10 million human lives, was paid by the people the company was extracting from. It was, financially speaking, a perfect model. It was, by any other measure, something else entirely. By the late 1700s, the EIC had created a financial problem that even its Bengal revenues could not solve. The British had developed a near-cultural addiction to Chinese tea. The EIC held the monopoly on that trade. The problem was the bill. China accepted only silver in payment for its goods, and Britain was spending so much silver acquiring Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain that it was running a structural deficit with the most populous nation on Earth. The math was brutal. The EIC was hemorrhaging silver to China. If it stopped buying Chinese goods, it lost the tea trade, the most valuable consumer product in Britain. If it continued, the silver drain would eventually become a crisis. And then someone in the company looked at the balance sheet and at a map and had an idea. Bengal produced opium. China had a growing appetite for it. What if, instead of paying China in silver, the EIC paid in product? The EIC forced Bengal's farmers to grow opium under contract. They had no legal right to refuse, and the prices were set by the company. The opium was auctioned in Calcutta, then shipped to China through private traders, maintaining official distance from the product itself. The silver came back. The tea went to Britain. The deficit closed. In purely financial terms, it worked. The EIC's balance sheet stabilized. The deficit closed. Shareholders were kept happy. When the Chinese government moved to stop the opium trade, burning EIC shipments worth over $2 million, writing directly to Queen Victoria to appeal to her conscience, Britain went to war. Twice. The Opium Wars. 2 wars, fought by the British Army, funded by British taxpayers to protect the profit margin of a corporation. The bill for that protection would eventually come due. By the mid-1800s, the East India Company directly administered more territory and more people than any government in the world. Its revenues were extraordinary, but so were its costs. This is the paradox that every extractive empire eventually confronts. The more territory you control, the more it costs to hold it. The more it costs to hold it, the more aggressively you must extract from it. The more aggressively you extract, the more resistance you generate. The more resistance you generate, the more soldiers you need. The more soldiers you need, the more it costs. The EIC's army had grown to over 200,000 men, twice the size of the British Army, and it was the single largest line item on the company's balance sheet. An army that size does not generate revenue. It consumes it. The EIC's shareholders had gotten rich on the revenues of an empire. But empires, it turned out, were expensive to run. May 10th, 1857. Meerut. Indian soldiers, sepoys, serving in the EIC's own army, opened fire on their British officers. Within weeks, the uprising had spread across northern and central India. Delhi fell to the rebels. EIC garrisons were overwhelmed. The military machine the company had built to protect its revenues was now destroying them. Parliament demanded to see the accounts, and what Parliament found was that the world's most valuable company was insolvent. The dividends had been paid, the shareholders had become wealthy, but the company had been running on borrowed time for years. The cost of holding the empire had exceeded the revenue of the empire. The extraction model had extracted itself to death. In 1858, the British Crown dissolved the East India Company and assumed direct control of India. The $7 trillion company had nothing left. On June 1st, 1874, the East India Company was formally wound up. No ceremony, no monument, no acknowledgement of the scale of what was ending. A company that had once been valued at $7 trillion in today's money settled its final accounts and ceased to exist. But here is the financial autopsy that matters. The EIC was not brought down by its enemies. It was not conquered. It was not outcompeted. It was destroyed by the internal logic of its own model. The profit had been privatized, paid as dividends to shareholders over 274 years of operation. The costs had been socialized, paid by the people of Bengal, paid by the people of India, and in the end, paid by the British taxpayer who absorbed the company's debts and fought its wars. Privatize the gains, socialize the losses. That is not a historical observation. That is a description of a structural problem that has never been solved. The East India Company has been gone for 150 years. The financial architecture it built has not. The EIC pioneered the joint stock company, the publicly traded corporation, the model of pooling private capital to fund operations too large for any individual investor. Every publicly traded company on Earth today is operating on a legal and financial structure the EIC helped create. Apple, Microsoft, Saudi Aramco, the largest companies in the world today, none of them have come close to what the East India Company was worth at its peak, because none of them have been given what the EIC was given: a government-granted monopoly over an entire hemisphere of global trade, the legal right to collect taxes from 250 million people, sovereign powers, the right to wage war, negotiate treaties, and issue currency, granted to a private enterprise answerable to shareholders. The EIC was not just the most valuable company in history. It was the most powerful argument ever made for why corporations need limits. The legal frameworks that govern corporate behavior today, antitrust law, limits on monopolies, separation of commercial and governmental power, were built, at least in part, in direct response to what the East India Company demonstrated was possible. We did not solve the problem the EIC created. We just made it harder to repeat it at that scale. So far, 218 merchants put their names on a document. They wanted to buy spices cheaper. In the 274 years that followed, the company they created became worth $7 trillion. It governed more people than any government on Earth. It controlled trade across half the world. It paid its shareholders returns that made them extraordinarily rich. And when it finally collapsed, it left behind debts the British government spent decades repaying. A subcontinent reshaped by a century of extraction, and a financial model still running in every stock market on Earth. The lesson is not that corporations are evil. The lesson is simpler than that. When a company is allowed to privatize its gains and externalize its costs at sufficient scale, the gains are spectacular, right up until the moment the costs come due. The most valuable company in history lasted 274 years. It was worth $7 trillion, and in the end, it could not pay its bills. The company is gone. The model it proved never went away.